Hello, and welcome to another episode in Brooklyn Law School's ongoing series on law in time of crisis. I am Michael Cahill, the Dean at Brooklyn Law School, and I am delighted to be joined today by one of the newest members of our faculty, Wilfred Codrington, who is just coming to us. He's been on the job for about 2 weeks now, officially, joining us from the Brennan Center at NYU. He is an expert on constitutional law and particularly election law, which is what we are here to talk about today. Conveniently enough, it is an election year, but inconveniently enough, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. So as we've had a number of primaries already through this election season, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how the elections have been going thus far and what issues have arisen.
Yeah, so I would just say, recall at the beginning of this year, the president was being tried in the Senate on articles of impeachment, and underlying those charges were acts of foreign interference in our elections. So the focus of many in the election community has been on election security in the lead up to the November elections. And that concern has not vanished, nor did the concerns about election funding for important upgrades to election equipment in the states. And this is even more important now due to state budget shortfalls in light of the COVID pandemic. So now we're in the second half of 2020 and we're struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic, as you said, and we're doing so in a way that other countries aren't. And we have this public health emergency, this economic emergency, and now election-related emergency. I guess what do I mean by this is that we have to just recall that when we vote in November, we're not voting in one singular election because states run the elections mostly. And therefore, we have 51 separate state and elections or more because localities are also involved in this. And during the beginning of this year, many states began to hold their primaries and caucuses, and then COVID hit and they were not prepared for the consequences. So they weren't prepared for the social distancing that's necessary, or the shortage of poll workers and supplies. They were not prepared for the sanitation and other protocol needs that were required to run an election during this time. So right now, what they were trying to do, many of them were postponing their elections, and they were thinking that maybe the pandemic would subside some, or they'd at least have time to prepare. But we're seeing the results have been pretty checkered.
Are there examples of states that have done particularly well or particularly poorly as we've seen the process going on? And are there any patterns that have emerged in terms of what types of states maybe have been better equipped to handle this and others that have been more challenged?
Sure. Yeah. So there are definitely examples. I guess we can put them in three buckets. There's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ugly. So the good, they include a bunch of states, frankly, that have already conducted their elections mostly by mail. So when Oregon and Hawaii, for example, had their primaries in May, for them, certainly the pandemic changed things, but they were able to conduct their elections in a way that was pretty seamless. Most states do not conduct all-mail voting, and about a third of the states, they require voters to declare one of a limited number of excuses in order to get a mail ballot or an absentee vote ballot. But a bunch of these states actually have been foregoing those needs to show excuses so that they can expand voting and make absentee voting more widely accessible. And they're doing so despite, the president's claim raising the specter of voting fraud, which we know is infinitesimal. I guess the bad is Georgia. Georgia would be a good example of that. Georgia is near and dear to my heart. My siblings live in Atlanta, so I think about it a lot. But it's newly near and dear to the country's heart. And that's because it seems to be a presidential battleground state. And there are also two Senate elections. Their primary was scheduled for March initially. And then they moved it, which was a good move. But the wrong move they had was a combination of a few things. Difficulty getting absentee ballots out in a timely manner, consolidating polling sites, and rolling out untested voting equipment. So in Fulton and DeKalb counties, which are the metro Atlanta area, there were these long lines that we saw in the news, some people waiting up to 8 hours to vote. And if Georgia is the bad, then Wisconsin is the ugly. Now, you might recall that while other states were postponing their elections, in Wisconsin, there was some jockeying between the governor and the legislator, the governor being a Democrat, the legislator being led by Republicans, about whether or not they would postpone their elections to better prepare for this. And there was a COVID emergency order in place. The governor wanted to delay it, and the legislator did not. So this was an issue. And then there was a ruling in April by a federal district court, some 5 days before the primary was set to go off. And the ruling was largely in favor of the Democrats and voting rights groups that brought the litigation. And the court did not postpone the election, which is important. But what it did do is it modified the state's laws regarding absentee balloting and other measures. So there was a skyrocket in the demand for absentee ballots, as you can imagine, and this caused a backlog in the processing of those requests with the election officials. So untold thousands were just not getting their ballots and enough time to have them back. So the court extended the deadline for the election office to receive those applications for absentee ballots by a day. The court also loosened its requirements for the ballots having to be witnessed. And then the court also allowed that mail ballots, once they were sent off, could be accepted up to 6 days after the election, and they didn't need to have a postmark date. So these were measures that the lower court put in place to make sure that the vote was available more widely. The Republicans repealed the order, and then the Supreme Court weighed in. The Supreme Court ultimately stayed the lower court's decision, so put it on hold. On the day before the primary election, in a case called the Republican National Committee versus the Democratic National Committee, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court essentially dismissed concerns that were raised and the lower court's findings, basically not looking at this as an emergency situation, not looking at this as extraordinary times, and really just nothing. So during a pandemic, the court basically forced voters to decide between their public health and their fundamental right to vote. So that's what I see. And I guess to add insult to injury, in Milwaukee, where 70% of the state's Black population lives, they normally have 180 polling places. That was reduced to 5. And in light of the election, there were dozens of COVID positive cases traced to the election. And really, we shouldn't be too surprised by this, that this is happening in the most diverse parts of the state, in Wisconsin and Georgia. These are problems that really Black and Latino populations in states have to face all the time. The Brennan Center for Justice recently released a report showing that Black and Latino voters have to wait 45 and 46 minutes longer than white voters to cast their votes. So at a time where many people don't even get the time off to vote, we're facing this pandemic. And if they do get the time off to vote, it's often not long enough to wait for these lines. This is just not good. So having seen this happen already, the election officials are on notice. They need to do better to protect the right to vote.
So as you say, there are really as many elections as there are jurisdictions. And as we approach the general election, it turns out that all 50 states are going to be holding an election on the same day. So as we look forward to that, based on the experience that we've had in the primaries and lessons we might have learned from that, Is there cause for optimism or concern? Should we expect that it will be good or bad or ugly or some mix of those things?
I'm going to have to go back a little bit to the pessimism, but then I promise you I'll get to the optimism. So let me just quickly say that there's some reason to be pessimistic now. In most states, partisan officials run the elections. So any changes made in the lead up to the election, whether it's to help increase the ballot or turnout or help people vote or otherwise, that may be viewed with skepticism. There have already been some concerns with mail voting in the primaries. The late arrival of ballots, as I mentioned, was an issue for Wisconsin. Signature matching issues and other things that have resulted in a number of ballots not being counted. And then there are just the sadly run-of-the-mill things that tend to have an impact on typically minority communities and poor communities, like bogus claims of rampant voter fraud and election eve purges that result in vote suppression. But I do think that there is some reason for optimism. I promise you I would get here. But I think that most officials are actually trying to do good, and they're going to try to do their best. I think that in light of what has occurred in the primaries, officials are learning, and they're really going to try to do their best to get people out to vote. I think when courts step in, for the most part, they'll do so with good intentions, and they'll do so in a way that will actually result in the right things. And most importantly, I am confident that voters want to vote. And despite some of the chaotic scenes that we have seen in the primaries, we've actually seen something about the motivation of voters. In many states, we've still seen record turnout in the number of people who voted. So I am confident that people are going to do their damnedest to get their mail-in ballots in on time, to do their social distancing, to just hunker down in voting lines, to vote, waiting with pizza and coffee, do whatever they need to make sure that their voice is heard in November. So that gives me some reason for optimism.
Almost literally, as we started recording this, the Supreme Court apparently made a decision not to lift a stay in a case in Florida involving felon disenfranchisement or re-enfranchisement. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the general issue of felon disenfranchisement and its more recent history and sort of the movement to limit felon disenfranchisement.
Felon disenfranchisement, these laws, they really go back to the 1800s. And the idea is that there was a sense of who was an appropriate, upstanding citizen who should be able to participate in our democracy. And after the Civil War, when Black people were given the right to vote, when they won the right to vote, a spate of states in the South started imposing different ways to keep Black people from the ballot. And they also started criminalizing a bunch of behavior that was associated with Black conduct. So sort of joining these two things together, what they had were felon and disenfranchisement laws. So if you were loitering or idling or any number of vague behavior, you could be imprisoned. And once you were imprisoned, you could have your vote taken away from you then and thereafter. Fast forward now, we have Florida, which is one of those states that had one of those bans, and the voters just decided that enough was enough, and they overwhelmingly passed a state constitutional amendment, Amendment 4, to get rid of the state's felon disenfranchisement law. As soon as that was done, the state legislature passed legislation trying to restrict the reach of that decision. Notably, what they did was they said, well, if you have court fines and fees and other sorts of monetary payments that you have to make that are outstanding, you can't vote. So the effect of this was to really decrease the reach of that Amendment 4. Now we're in a time of pandemic. So there's been a lot of litigation about this, but now we're in a time of pandemic and the state doesn't have a way to tell people how much they actually owe and to who they owe the money to. So you have this thing that is on top of this, this already difficult situation, which is reversing the mandate of the voters. Now you don't have these otherwise eligible populations to find out how they can go about voting. This has gone in the court, and basically the district court there, the federal district court, said that this was a poll tax, which is unconstitutional. You can't condition the vote on the requirement for a payment. The 11th Circuit ultimately heard and reheard this matter, and they imposed a stay of the district court order that was lifting the state legislators' law. And just as we started talking, the Supreme Court weighed in and basically upheld that stay. So the implication is that unless something extraordinary happens in the interim, 1.4 million eligible voters, because of this amendment, may not be able to vote. We're not sure the number of people within that, but that was the total number of people who were supposed to be re-enfranchised by the passage of Amendment 4.
Well, these issues are certainly particularly salient at the moment, but they are always important and evergreen in terms of their significance for law and for our democracy. And we are delighted to have you joining our faculty to help us think about those issues, teach about those issues, and conduct research that will hopefully improve what's happening with respect to those issues out in the world. Professor Wilfred Codrington, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Law in Time of Crisis.